Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. So we were instructed by Veritas to bring in an application to fight corruption. As all of you know, Chapter 9 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe deals with the basic values and principles governing public administration. And Chapter 9 demands accountability. Chapter 9 demands transparency. Chapter 9 demands respect. Chapter 9 demands ethical conduct. Chapter 9 demands the sacrosanctity of the citizen in public administration. It is very clear. You must respect the customer. You must respect the citizen. Chapter 9 then goes on to outline certain expectations of public officials and particularly of state-owned companies. One of the things that Chapter 9 actually does is to say that companies that are state-owned should have terms of office of their appointed managers. So in Zimbabwe, you've got the mischief of certain chief executive officers who regard their state-owned enterprises as a fiefdom. You have had people running organizations such as Zimra staying there for so many years. I shan't mention names. Zimbabwe, so many parastatals, GMP, and so forth. So Chapter 9 says there must be terms of office. Chapter 9 says there must be codes of conduct. So Chapter 9 is about dealing with corruption. Chapter 9 says there must be regular asset disclosure. Section 198 then says a law must be passed by government to codify the demands and values that are reflected in Chapter 9. So the court application which we filed in the name of Honorable Rusty Markham, also known as Alan Norman Markham, was one to compel the government to pass this law, was one to say the government had failed to fulfill its constitutional obligation, because Section 324 of the Constitution says all constitutional obligations must be complied with timeously. So we are pleased to report that the High Court of Zimbabwe has issued a judgment ordering the government to come up with this law in the next 3 months. And we hope that the government will enact this law that fights corruption, that holds public officials, government ministers, parastatals, members of parliament, anyone who benefits from public funds to be accountable, local authority officials to be accountable. We expect this law to do the following. Number one, to define the high expectations, particularly on financial accountability, particularly on fiscal prudence. Oftentimes, someone joins the public service with one goat. By the time he leaves public service, he owns 400 heads of cattle, and there is no explanation as to why, where he would have gotten those resources. Number two, we expect this law to empower the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority with the capacity to conduct lifestyle audits. We ought to know why you are building a house on the hill in Shawasha Hills when you have not been paying any taxes and when you are just a civil servant. We expect this law to ask a public servant to explain why his garage is full of SUVs when his salary can't afford a Honda Fit or a Toyota Wish. We expect this law to deal with the issue of ethics, ethics, things such as non-disclosure, things such as respect of the institution. Nowadays, those values have gone. We expect this law to come up with terms of office of chief executive officer. Now everyone has got term limits. The president has got term limits, 2 terms of office. Even commanders of security forces have got term limits. The Speaker of Parliament has got term limits. Chairpersons of commissions have got term limits. But chief executive officers have got blank checks, and they end up being little emperors in those bodies. So we expect this law to be enacted. Veritas is going to. The government at the present moment has got a shortage of draftsmen, and Veritas has got some of the country's leading drafters, including and in particular Brian Crozier. So we hope that Veritas will draft a draft bill which they will give to the Attorney General so that the Attorney General can comply with the judgment of Justice Manzunzu. Finally, I would like to thank Veritas. I've worked with Veritas in many landmark test cases. Some of you know I worked with Veritas in 2016 when we won the child marriage case, the case of Loveness Mutsuri and Rovimbo Tsopodzi that outlawed child marriages. I've worked with Veritas in the age of sexual consent case, the case that says the age of sexual consent can only be 18. We are doing a lot of other things behind doors, particularly around torture, particularly around the death penalty. So I want to commend Veritas. I also want to commend the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, which two organizations have been involved in test case litigation. Tendai Biti Law is a very small law firm, but we take the law to its boundaries. We stretch the limits of the law. We're very imaginative, we're very aggressive, but we won't be able to do what we do without the support of organizations such as Veritas. We are very proud of these judgments because they expand the jurisprudence, they expand the law. They are very, very difficult to do. Many people think law is a white-collar job. It's not. It's a blue-collar job. You have to spend hours in a library. Sometimes you don't even know what you are looking at. It's thankless. It's painful, but it helps the citizens. It advances the rights of citizens. So I want to thank Veritas, Val Ingham Thorpe, and the entire team at Veritas for continuing to allow us to do this creative public interest litigation. I thank you very much.
What's your expectation now that you've won this case? You have talked about the government not enacting any of the legislation that supports some of the previous cases that you've won. What's the lead time?
The government was given 3 months, and 3 months is a very short period. It's basically 90 days. In some of the cases where we have won, and again working with Veritas, one of the cases which we won was a case brought by Makomborore Aruzivishi to force the government to enact the complaints mechanism against security forces defined in section 210 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. Government was given 6 months, but here government has been given 3 months. And I think it's because the courts appreciate the seriousness of corruption. But as I said, Veritas has got arguably the country's best draftsman in Brian Crozier. So our hope is that we will make the government job easier by coming up with this comprehensive law. And remember, other countries have got similar legislation. So it's a question of doing research and cutting and pasting various legislation. Brian Crozier is an expert. Then we'll hand over to government, to Deputy Attorney General Dias, government chief draftsman. But I hope that the government can move with speed on this issue, because corruption is costing this country. Out of every dollar received by the government, 85 cents are not being accounted for. So those are high levels of corruption. And you see corruption in the state of our roads, the absence of electricity, the absence of water. That is proof of the corruption that is happening in this country.
Thank you.